Hi. I was listening last night for the first time a speech by Jesse Ventura, the former governor of Minnesota and a former professional wrestler, in 2011. And what stunned me was how much his ideas, or my ideas, overlapped with his. And the reason I was surprised, I shouldn't have been, but I was surprised because I have had a lot of formal education, and Ventura has not. And the thing that we both have is an independent streak and integrity. And so maybe it should not have been surprising that he and I share a lot of similar ideas. One thing he did, by the way, he banned lobbyists when he became governor. That's a bold move. I'm not sure you can do that if you're drafting laws. In other words, what lobbyists do a lot of the time is they draft legislation. And if you are a governor, you're the executive. You're not in the you're not a legislator. So you probably can dump lobbyists, although I'm not sure how that's going to work in terms of foreign policy on a national level. But in any case, Ventura had a lot of interesting ideas. And, a lot of that, again, that independence seems to result from the pattern that the uneducated people in this country, or I should say the less formally educated people in this country, are seemingly better able to pierce through the propaganda in order to say the truth, whether it's Muhammad Ali, Malcolm X, or Jesse Ventura in 2011. And one thing he said was really interesting in the Google talk. He said that, news reporting and journalism, it used to be sort of a charitable effort by networks, by television networks. In other words, we would make the money on entertainment, and then, in order to give yourself some ballast, to give your company substance, you would then fund, as a money loser, as a loss maker, you would then fund the news. And when 60 Minutes came out, it was so good at reporting that it started to make money. And for the first time, networks and executives realized they could make money on the news. And Ventura says that was a terrible thing. It's counterintuitive, but he said it was terrible because, rather than news becoming an effort or some sort of non-profit arm of a for-profit corporate entity, it was subsumed into just sort of an everyday line item in a corporate budget, with profit lost, becoming as relevant as entertainment. So what the news, this is what Ventura said very well. He said that when the networks discovered that they could make money on the news, they went from reporting the news to making the news. Now let that sink in for a moment. That's exactly what we have now. This is in 2011, before the term fake news was, I guess, popularized. Ventura predicted all of that back in 2011, or probably earlier than that. And here we are. Now, keep in mind, we're 10 years down the road from a speech that makes almost perfect sense. And things have gotten worse and more entrenched. And I believe Ventura has even left the United States for Mexico, nearby the border, but still in a foreign country. And which tells you that I'm not sure whether that means he's given up on political change or he's, I'm just not sure. He did mention that he was getting older, and so he wasn't going to run for president. He mentioned that he was supporting Ron Paul. Well, Ron Paul ran for president, and nothing was changed either. Things again have gotten worse, and part of it is this idea that things have simply been upgraded from analog to digital. And what do I mean by that? In other words, the interests in government, when they realized that they could be replaced or supplanted by technology. All of their institutions could be taken over, and their influence could be supplanted by technology's promise of better data, which means, in other words, that you can't influence through bribes or just general political influence. You happen to know somebody in the government, that person, you trust that person, he tells you to do something, and you just do it because that's the person that gave you a job. So technology, of course, removes that human bond in many cases in a transaction and focuses solely on data. It remains to be seen whether this is going to continue, this idea of human institutions, of technology making human institutions and human nature more honest simply by creating expensive checks and balances. And the reason I say that is because just look at the banks, right? JP Morgan spends billions of dollars a year on online security. When it was just a small bank, probably many decades ago, its security was probably limited to just a physical human being standing somewhere next to the vault. So we go from that person to billions of dollars a year. The idea that blockchain is going to make things cheaper and therefore more honest, I'm not sure. In other words, more honest because you'll have a better chance of competition and less concentration of power. I'm not sure if that's going to be true eventually, but I really don't know. But as part of this digital quote unquote upgrade, what I'm looking at now is, let me give you an example of why things haven't changed. We talked before about how art is in many cases just a scam because it's really not designed to improve culture. It's really just designed to get a tax break, a tax write-off. And we talked about how, all you got to do is get somebody who, if you're part of a network or connected to a network, you can pay some artist, $10,000 to make something that's postmodern, which might even include throwing a bucket of paint on a canvas. And then what the real value, of course, is your ability to generate buzz around the creator, the artist. And in doing so, elevate the value of that, meaningless canvas in terms of utility, meaningless in terms of utility. You're able to elevate the value of that tenfold or 100-fold over time by building a story around the artist. And so you can see also why independent media has been so much more successful than mainstream media in generating substance. If in fact a lot of the artwork in this country and a lot of the artists are essentially funded as a way of getting a tax break. And what's happened now, this relatively new idea of digital is this idea of digital tokens. And digital tokens, which I'm sure have some sort of relevance to the blockchain. In other words, this idea of greater security online. They include, say, a professional basketball player dunking, a 3-second clip. And so we've got this idea that, you can digitize that television content, that media content, and then sell it, and then put it as a token somewhere in the digital realm that is unique. And so this happened also with Twitter's first tweet that was sold for millions of dollars, a low, maybe $2 or $3 million. But you can see how the blockchain is becoming, again, this perhaps less concentrated, but still, capable of being co-opted eventually by the people who have the same interests. Now, the idea again is that suddenly you've got this highlight reel that has a license that somebody owns, and you're able to, just by digitizing it and putting it on the blockchain, you're able to essentially double its value. In other words, you've got a physical object, it's worth, say, $10, or whatever, let's say $1 million. You're able to, simply by digitizing it in a format that can be sold on somebody else's technology, you're able to essentially create value out of nothing. So you haven't improved society, you haven't done anything unique. Even the content, right, is still the same. It's just a different format. And, You've got inflation, you've got, the ability of a protected class, an exclusive class. You're in a position where, you're able to just essentially make value out of thin air. Alchemy. We talked about alchemy, right? It was a big deal back then. Making gold out of lead. And this is what this appears to be, the modern version of that. The problem, of course, is that if it leads to tax breaks, then, which it certainly will, if you donate it, and eventually, some people will get rich and somebody will get, well, a lot of people will get some tax deductions. Just simply by having a $10,000 investment, it's already, we're not talking about quintupling, it's already, gone up 100 times in some cases from the original price. So somebody can buy that and then donate it, and you're looking at a problem of infinite expansion without adding anything substantive. It's the same thing, but suddenly this thing, because it's digital, has the capacity to increase in value infinitely. And that has always been the allure. Just like alchemy with physical objects back in the day, the allure of, has always been getting something for nothing. And I hate the fact that I'm sounding so moralistic, so Protestant. That's not my intent. My intent is to try to show that an economic system, to the extent that it's sustainable, has to be grounded in a system that improves everyone's lives. That's really what it is. So when we talk about making things out of nothing, we're not talking about Protestant work ethic. We're not talking about anything other than just this idea that if you allow an even greater concentration of wealth without giving back something to society, you're not dealing with a sustainable economic system. And so, you've got this, but again, the idea of the digital has always been that it's infinite, just like space. Space has always fascinated the human mind. Why? Just like the digital realm, it's in theory infinite. Now, of course, practically digital data requires space somewhere. So in practical terms, there is a limit somewhere, right? It's just obviously a much higher limit than, say, a neighborhood with physical objects in it. You can only expand this street. In fact, you probably can't expand the street anymore. It's stuck there, right? It's limited by the physical dimension. If it's digital, you can do anything you want with it, right? You can go up, side. You talk about this idea of multiple dimensions, what Einstein talked about. And so it's always been really, really interesting for the human mind to try to create from something mortal and finite, something immortal and infinite. And that's what's really going on here. And when you look at this, right, you can see why nothing has really changed, because it's simply, you're not adding value in a way that makes everyone better off. And in doing so, you're tilting the economic field into essentially a psychological field. How many tall tales can you tell before you lose credibility? How much fake news can your society stomach before it wakes up and says, these digital tokens are a scam on the government and the ability of the government to collect tax revenue, we're going to shut it down. If you do that, what about this idea that even a piece of paper, the dollar bill, has no intrinsic value? What do you do about that? Why is one story more believable over the other? Well, the answer to that is quite frankly obvious, right? The dollar is being used as an exchange medium that upgrades the former barter system, right? And we all know the barter system is inefficient. And so when you barter physical objects, there's a lot of supply issues and so on and so forth. So demand issues are inconsistent. So by having a dollar, this accepted value of exchange that is universal locally, you're adding value, you're increasing efficiency. The difference here is that with digital tokens and the digital realm, is that it's expanding but without any value added. It's not upgrading the previous system, which means it's in danger of collapse at some point because it's unsustainable. And this also ties in to what's happening now with respect to the pandemic. So you've got this idea that, you've got a pandemic which allows the government to essentially transfer wealth to the medical sector and the pharmaceutical sector and the psychology sector. And I say psychology because, you've got this idea that, if the president authorizes the federal government to buy X number of vaccines from an American corporation. That's a transfer of wealth from the American public to a private corporation. But within that, you've got this idea that you can lobby in a way that, allows that private corporation, which doesn't only make vaccines, right? It makes a lot of other drugs. A lot of them are psychotropic. A lot of them are, dealing with mental health, for example. And the original basis of moving into allowing insurance to cover mental health was in order to wipe out the black market on quote unquote illicit and dangerous drugs. Remember, was always a sound basis and an upgrade in the system for everyone. So in the old days, if you had, if you were, if you went out and got marijuana, there's no guarantee because of quality control, storage issues, potential for jail time for the sellers. There was no guarantee that your batch would be, good, right? You've got a lot of systems and corporations that are supposed to provide quality control. And so, even one death is a tragedy if it could have been prevented easily. The idea behind having these pharmaceutical companies, put so much money in research and development was to supplant the criminal sector, the black market, in order to improve it. So you then generate drugs. There's a quote from a documentary that says that, from somebody who used to abuse drugs by buying them on the street. And she said, the best drug dealer I ever had was my doctor. Because you go in, insurance covers it, you're classified in a way that essentially boots you out of polite society to the extent that privacy is not present. And then you've got this idea that you become, in some way, simply a vessel for tax breaks and pharmaceutical companies and transfers of wealth that are designed to create a modern-day Soma. Soma, of course, goes back to Huxley's Brave New World. This is nothing new. The whole idea has always been that governments have, due to excessive concentration of power and the desire to maintain power, they've always wanted to rely not on justice, but on superficial means of improving, or not just, distracting you. And not just distracting you, but improving your life in a way that's cheap to them, but looks expensive to you. And with the pandemic, insurance companies have to cover mental health issues. Well, one of the reasons for that is because, we talk about physical space limiting expansion and limiting GDP. In other words, there's always a limit to real estate, especially when it becomes so concentrated, and in terms of ownership. And so, what really happened over the last 40 years, we shut down mental asylums and then we put people in jail. The jails became the new mental asylums because now they've got doctors there, they've got nurses there now in jail. Even a lowly county jail, especially now because of COVID, has a nurse on site. So this is going to be a quote-unquote, temporary addition and therefore expansion of the medical sector, which of course harkens back to what Friedman said about government programs, that there is nothing quite so permanent as a temporary government program. So you get this idea that you're expanding all these different conduits. And it used to be that you were doing that in order to not to recycle money within the same economic system that wasn't making everyone better off. In other words, you weren't trying to do it to maintain the status quo by artificially generating cash flow into your preferred providers of services. You weren't doing it that way. You were doing it to make everything better, to supplant the black market, to supplant criminal actors that use violence in order to enforce contracts. So supplanting all of that, suddenly it does make sense, right? Sure, you might have gotten rid of the mental asylums, but you're going to upgrade it because local governments didn't want to pay for mental asylums. State governments didn't want to pay for it. They realized the federal government would pay for prisons or jails, right? Especially after 9/11, when the Department of Homeland Security received a lot of money and had to give that out. And, not just in terms of equipment, but also in terms of funding. And so the jail sector took off, and suddenly we had private jails that also took off. Again, all of that was designed to replace the black market. It wasn't really intended to make the prison guard lobby, so powerful or as powerful as the pharmaceutical lobby, and on the state level. And what you have now with COVID, with this pandemic, it really does seem to be artificially generated fear in order to generate a transfer of wealth to the status quo, not to make things better, but to provide, especially after the ACA, to provide more cash flow into a system that seems to be failing everyone still because of the patchwork of healthcare regulations that have resulted since, a new healthcare law was passed, several years ago. And you sort of look at this and you wonder why anyone would do this. And, in other words, why would you knowingly sign up for a system that is probably designed to fail eventually? And the answer to that is actually pretty straightforward. The politicians don't have a choice. If you've allowed the banking system, I shouldn't say the banking system, if you've allowed debt to supplant taxes, in other words, that link between you and the individual resident in your neighborhood, what you've really done is you've made yourself and your government a slave to debt, which means that you have to maintain the cash flow, because at some point these numbers get so big they either have to be wiped out or there has to be essentially a rollover of debt, right? You have enough cash flow, you lower the interest rate, and you roll over these trillions of dollars of debt in a way that maintains the existing system. And that's what we've done now, right? We've lowered rates. In some cases, we've gone negative in order to maintain this system. That's the idea, again, that you're no longer able to pay off the debt. So what you're going to do is you're going to just maintain the cash flow that allows this debt to be paid off. What has resulted in the West has been a total loss of credibility. And the fake news debacle is really a result the inefficacy of politicians is really the result of debt supplanting that connection between the individual taxpayer and the local politician, which then works its way all the way up the chain. As local governments have to maintain balanced budgets, and they have to be, if to the extent they're running a lot of debt, at some point they become beholden either to the state government or any institution, right, or the private sector or banking system or any institution that allows them to exist in a way that's unsustainable. And Ventura mentioned the Federal Reserve. He mentioned Goldman Sachs. That's fine, but it's a bigger idea, right? The idea really is that when you live beyond your means in a way that creates a society that knows it will never pay off all the debt that it's incurred, you have to resort to artificial shenanigans in order to maintain the status quo. And that's how revolutions happen. People get upset if you can't make the illusion continue. People get upset, they rise up, there's an insurrection. If you own that much debt, quite frankly, wiping out a small number of people or jailing a small number of people becomes secondary or much easier than fixing the inherent problem. You can either jail, say, 100,000 people, or you can try to pay off your trillions of dollars of debt. Which one do you think is easier for the establishment to do? And that's what's happening now. And it's stunning because overall, there's an idea that the American empire is on its last legs. But it doesn't seem that way, right? There's a nice house. I just passed a couple with a brand new car. And you have to remember, though, most people don't own these houses. They don't own the cars. The houses are mortgaged. The cars have loans. The bank owns the house, right? And the bank is subservient to the Federal Reserve, like Ventura mentioned. A finance arm of an auto company actually owns the car to the extent that you're not paying cash. So things look very nice on the outside, and they should appear very nice on the outside, as long as that economic system of debt that's underpinning it, all these different transactions, is sustainable. And if it's not, what you really have is sort of an admission that your future will be more artificial stories, more outlandish stories that are designed to maintain the status quo, all of which go back to private, there's not just government debt, there's private debt. So when we talk about these digital tokens, they're making money out of thin air. You're really talking about this now competition between the private sector and the government sector for revenue. And it's a little bit stunning that more people don't understand what's happening, but it does also make sense because if you live in a society where debt has overtaken every single aspect of your empire, home and abroad, whether it's trying to get a college education, whether it's trying to buy a car, whether it's trying to get shelter, if you're in that society, and a society that doesn't recognize limits because it's been enamored with the new alchemy of its day, if you're in that society, why wouldn't you create a system that you think has the potential to be infinite, even if it's unsustainable? And it's not just this idea of economic unsustainability, this idea of drugs and pharmaceutical companies and psychology all coming together to create a multi-layered soma. It's the idea really has gone back many, many decades. There was a great show on Netflix called The Queen's Gambit. But before that, there was a movie called Searching for Bobby Fischer. And, psychology is designed to, again, improve outcomes without necessarily adding anything of substance. So, motivation, what is that? That's out of thin air, you're improving productivity. You're trying to make up for the fact that the larger and more diverse a society becomes, the harder it is to use intangible motivators like trust and just cultural similarities in order to spur outcomes that are more productive. And an example of that was, you have a very, very successful chess tutor and chess player tutoring a young child, and he motivates the child by putting out a certificate that says that here's a certificate. There are only X number of these certificates in existence. It's just a piece of paper. If you complete all these different certificates or all these different exercises, I will put your name on it and you can frame it, and you will be one of a small number of people that have this chess award. And this obviously motivates the boy, who's a prodigy. Turns out that when the boy doesn't do what the chess tutor wants him to do, the chess tutor becomes abusive. And it is eventually found out that, these papers are really nothing, right? It's just something that anybody could print off with a laptop and a printer. And you also see how this happens in law school, any school as well, right? If you think about it, what are grades? What are gold stars? What are all these things other than attempts to inflate something out of thin air? So, and you look at, when I went to law school, I had a professor, not just law school, by the way, even my undergraduate, I had a couple of professors say that, if you participate, I'm going to, in class, by asking questions or answering them, I'm going to give you a 20% participation credit. Well, and, somebody would come in and, over the first couple of weeks, whenever anybody would ask a question, the professor would make a big show out of going to a notebook and just checking a box and then answering the student's question. She stopped doing that after a while. Same thing in the undergraduate course. Come to find out, it was all fake, right? It was just a way to use psychological techniques in order to improve outcomes. And once you realize, just like the chess prodigy, that it was all fake, there was a rebellion. You suddenly destroyed the entire basis of trust between society and the individual. Because the idea of these stories is to impart lessons, but also to create a value system that makes everyone better off by voluntarily joining the value system. And if you're resorting to tricks, if you're resorting to digital alchemy, simply more ways of tricking people, there is going to be a rebellion. And oftentimes repression, as the status quo responds to the rebellion. And what we've done now with this $2 trillion or $1.9 trillion package is we're trying to buy people off. We're trying to say, you know what, we know things are failing, we understand it, let's just try to make everybody rich. And once upon a time, I favored that approach. I said that, if you want a stable society, well, one of the most stable societies is Singapore. 10% of its population are millionaires. And you can see the value of trying to make everybody rich as your political platform. But if you're doing it in a way that is a giveaway, that doesn't increase value for everyone, that does it through artificial means like psychological tricks and artificial debt or unsustainable debt, you've got a problem. Singapore is not actually the right comparator in this case, because Singapore, of course, its 10% of its population might be millionaires, but the country, despite being small enough to drive across its entirety in about an hour, assuming not a straight line, but assuming that, the country has a sovereign wealth fund of $1 trillion. It's obviously not dependent on debt. If anything, it's now established itself not only as an important and essential port, but it's used its leadership in shipbuilding and port expertise to move on to a banking sector and a financial sector that is able to transact better than other countries and other financial systems, international settlements. And it's using that to become a leader in digital financial technology. So you can see how there's a difference between what Singapore is doing and what the United States is doing. And what Biden's election and this $1.9 trillion bailout package, called a stimulus package, what it really is an admission that the United States no longer has values that are capable of being exported. And what that usually means is that absent some sort of U-turn, that we're going to become more segregated. We're going to become more divided. And ultimately, we're not going to run the show. As Justice Kagan wrote, at some point, when the digital realm is able to gather data so accurately and then shape outcomes based on that data, at some point, we the people in the Constitution become sovereign no longer.